The afternoon brought precisely the sort of weather that made Miss Marple grateful for her sitting-room fire. She had settled into her favorite chair with a cup of Earl Grey and the village newsletter when there came an urgent knock at her door. It was hardly polite visiting hour, and Miss Marple's curiosity, though well concealed behind decades of practiced gentility, quickened at the interruption. The caller was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the Reverend's wife, a woman of 65 who prided herself on her composure and her position as the village's moral compass. Today, however, her composure had fractured noticeably. Her face was flushed and her gloved hands twisted together with obvious anxiety. "Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not intruding," Mrs. Whitmore began, though her very presence indicated she had abandoned such considerations some minutes prior. "But I simply didn't know where else to turn. There's been the most dreadful situation, and I thought, well, you have such a sensible way of looking at things." Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite and watched as her visitor settled herself with the awkward tension of someone bearing unwelcome news. She had known Eleanor Whitmore for nearly 30 years, since the Reverend's appointment to St. Mary's. Eleanor was a woman of principle, sometimes rigidly so, but fundamentally kind. Her current distress appeared genuine. "It's Victoria Lane," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, glancing toward the window as though the name itself might travel through glass and walls. "After the service this morning, she and my husband had words in the vestry. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, truly I didn't, but I was collecting the hymn books, and the voices were elevated." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "What sort of words, Mrs. Whitmore? That's the difficulty," Eleanor said, her voice dropping further. "I couldn't hear it all clearly, but there was mention of the past, of debts unpaid, and consequences. Victoria said something about how she wouldn't be silenced any longer, and my husband, well, he seemed terribly distressed. He told her this wasn't the time or place, that such matters should be left alone." The older woman shifted uncomfortably. "Then this evening, just before I came here, I received a telephone call from Margaret Ashford. Victoria has gone missing. She was supposed to have supper with Mrs. Patterson. They've become acquainted recently, you see, but she never arrived. No one has seen her since the service ended." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm demeanor that had become her trademark. Missing persons in small villages rarely stayed missing for long. They generally turned up at a neighboring village, or having changed their plans without informing anyone. Yet the timing was suggestive, and the altercation in the vestry more suggestive still. "Has anyone informed the police?" Miss Marple asked. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you first," Mrs. Whitmore said, and here was the crux of her visit, Miss Marple realized. "My husband is terribly worried that if the police become involved, the nature of their conversation will become public. And I confess, Miss Marple, I'm concerned as well. There are things in this village, old things, that are best left undisturbed. Victoria's return has already stirred quite enough talk." Before Miss Marple could respond, her telephone rang. She excused herself and moved to the hall, returning moments later with an expression that suggested her caller had confirmed Mrs. Whitmore's anxieties. It was Mrs. Patterson, Victoria's intended dinner companion, who had telephoned to ask if Miss Marple had any knowledge of Victoria's whereabouts. The younger woman had not been seen, and her cottage curtains remained drawn. "I think we must inform Superintendent Harris," Miss Marple said firmly, though not unkindly. "Missing persons cannot remain a private matter, regardless of the complications involved. However, Mrs. Whitmore, it might be wise if you and the Reverend were to come with me to make the report. It will be better received if it comes from your household, and it will prevent any unfortunate speculation about why outsiders were involved in village matters." Eleanor Whitmore's face reflected a struggle between propriety and alarm. Propriety, mercifully, lost. Within an hour, Miss Marple found herself at the police station, seated in Superintendent Harris's office alongside the Reverend and his wife, relating the morning's events with her characteristic precision. The superintendent, a capable man in his 50s who had learned long ago to take Miss Marple's observations seriously, listened intently. When she mentioned the overheard conversation in the vestry, she watched the Reverend's reaction with careful attention. His discomfort was evident, though whether it stemmed from embarrassment or genuine concern was not yet clear. By evening, a search had been organized. Constables fanned out across Thornfield's quiet streets and surrounding countryside, checking gardens, hedgerows, and the small lanes that wound through the village. Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, her fire now cold, her tea long forgotten. She sat in the gathering darkness, her fingers still, her mind remarkably active. The missing soprano. The mysterious conversation, the altercation that no one wished discussed. These elements arranged themselves in her thoughts like pieces of a pattern, not yet complete, but suggesting an emerging picture. Outside, the Christmas decorations twinkled merrily on, oblivious to the small tragedy that had descended upon Thornfield. The search continued through. Ugh, the night, with lanterns bobbing along Thornfield's paths like displaced stars. By dawn on December 24th, Victoria Lane had still not been found. Though the village had been thoroughly combed, Superintendent Harris had expanded the search to include the surrounding woodland and the old quarry on the village's eastern edge, places where a person might go if they wished to be alone, or if they wished to disappear. Miss Marple learned of these developments through the village's efficient gossip network, which functioned more reliably than any official communication system. Mrs. Hudson, her daily help, arrived at 8:30 with news that had already proliferated through 3 separate households before reaching Miss Marple's kitchen. The consensus was grim. Victoria had either run away again or come to some terrible harm. Opinion divided sharply along generational lines, with older residents favoring the former explanation and younger villagers expressing darker concerns. It was during this second morning that Miss Marple received an unexpected caller. David Pemberton, the Reverend's great-nephew, presented himself at her door looking distinctly uncomfortable. He was a lean man of 32, with nervous hands and the sort of expression that suggested he had only recently decided to do something he had long been contemplating. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind," he said, refusing the offered tea with visible agitation. "I've been thinking about the service yesterday, about Victoria's performance, and I thought perhaps, well, that is to say, I may have information that would be helpful to the police." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained pleasantly attentive. "Do sit down, Mr. Pemberton. Information is always useful, though sometimes its usefulness depends greatly upon context." David perched on the edge of the chair as though prepared for immediate flight. "I knew Victoria before she left Thornfield," he began carefully. 10 years ago, when she was still Victoria Ashford, we were acquainted. Not romantically," he added quickly, coloring slightly, "but we knew one another quite well. We were both in the Amateur Theatrical Society." This detail was new, and Miss Marple filed it away with interest. Christine Ashford's nervous glances during the carol took on additional significance. "And after she left," Miss Marple prompted gently. "We corresponded briefly," David admitted. "Just friendly letters, nothing improper. But she wrote to me about 3 months ago, asking if I remembered certain events from that time. Specifically, she asked if I recalled what happened during the summer of 1988, the season when the Theatrical Society performed A Midsummer Night's Dream." Miss Marple's mind immediately retrieved the memory. That production had been the subject of considerable village commentary, as such productions often were. There had been some scandal, though her recollection was vague on particulars, something involving one of the lead actors, she thought, though the details had faded beneath the weight of subsequent village dramas. "What did happen that summer?" Miss Marple asked. David's discomfort intensified. There was an accident during rehearsals. One of the actors, a boy named Thomas Ashford, Margaret Ashford's younger brother, fell from the stage rigging. He was quite badly injured. He recovered, eventually, but everyone said it was a miracle he survived at all. The name crystallized something in Miss Marple's memory. Thomas Ashford. She had a vague recollection of a young man who had left the village shortly after his recovery, moving abroad for reasons that had never been entirely clear. Margaret Ashford's family had been distinctly reticent about his departure. Why would Victoria be Asking about this now? Miss Marple inquired. That's what troubles me, David said. In her letter, Victoria suggested that the accident might not have been an accident at all. She said she had finally decided to speak about what she had witnessed, and she wanted to know if I would corroborate her account if necessary. I wrote back saying I wasn't certain what she meant, and I haven't heard from her since, until I saw her yesterday at the church, and her voice simply fell apart during that carol, and I thought. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. David believed Victoria's disappearance was connected to whatever knowledge she possessed about Thomas Ashford's accident. Miss Marple rose and moved to her small writing desk, retrieving a pen and paper. I think you should tell Superintendent Harris precisely what you've told me, Mr. Pemberton. This information is too important to withhold, regardless of any personal discomfort it might cause. However, before you do, I have a question for you. When Victoria performed that carol yesterday, after her voice wavered, did you notice where she looked? David considered this carefully. Toward the back of the church, toward where the Ashfords were sitting, toward Margaret Ashford specifically? Miss Marple asked. No, David said slowly, toward Christine. She stared directly at Christine Ashford, and Christine went absolutely white. After David departed, Miss Marple stood at her window, observing the Christmas decorations that now seemed to belong to a different, less complicated world. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not yet one she could articulate with certainty. A young man injured in an accident a generation ago. A woman returning to the village with dangerous memories. A daughter's inexplicable anxiety. And somewhere beneath it all, the question that haunted every small community, what? Secrets were worth preserving, and at what cost? The Christmas Eve bells would ring in a few hours. Miss Marple wondered if they would ring for a celebration or a tragedy. By midday on Christmas Eve, the search for Victoria Lane had taken on a quality of desperate routine. The police had expanded their investigation to include questioning all significant parties, and Superintendent Harris had established a temporary office in the village hall. Miss Marple, sitting in her living room with her knitting, found herself visited by the superintendent himself at 2:30, his expression suggesting he valued her perspective more than official protocol strictly warranted. Miss Marple, he began without preamble, I've spoken with David Pemberton about this matter of an old accident involving Thomas Ashford. The incident occurred 27 years ago, and by all accounts it was thoroughly investigated at the time. The conclusion was that young Pemberton, no relation to David incidentally, had been careless with the rigging. Yet now we're being told Victoria Lane possessed contrary information. Do you find this credible? Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. What I find credible, Superintendent, depends entirely on whether Miss Lane was the sort of person to construct elaborate falsehoods about ancient history, or whether she was the sort to carry uncomfortable truths in silence for years before finally deciding to speak. People's characters, I have found, remain remarkably consistent across decades. The superintendent smiled faintly. You're suggesting she was truthful? I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Miss Marple replied. I'm observing that you have not yet questioned Christine Ashford directly about her reaction to Miss Lane's performance, nor have you questioned Margaret Ashford about why she appeared so disapproving of the soprano's parting. I passion in the choir. These reactions deserve investigation before we determine whether Miss Lane's historical claims are genuine or manufactured. Harris nodded slowly. That's precisely why I'm here. I wanted your impression of Christine Ashford. You've known her since childhood, haven't you? Since infancy, Miss Marple confirmed. She was born while I was attending a garden party at her family home. I've watched her grow into a capable young woman, though one who has always seemed to carry a burden that her circumstances did not obviously warrant. She has been engaged 3 times and broken each engagement. She has declined several advantageous marriage proposals. She has, in short, behaved in ways that suggest either profound indecision or profound conflict. You think she knows something about Victoria Lane's disappearance? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Christine Ashford knows something about Victoria Lane's knowledge. Whether that knowledge pertains to her disappearance remains to be determined. The superintendent left soon after, but his visit had set events in motion. Within 2 hours, Christine Ashford was brought to the village hall for questioning. Miss Marple learned of this development through Mrs. Hudson, who had heard it from the butcher's wife, who had seen Christine being escorted past the high street. The village was beginning to understand that something more substantial than a simple missing person case was unfolding in their midst. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple decided to take a walk, despite the cold that had intensified throughout the day. She made her way to the church, ostensibly to observe the Christmas decorations, though her true purpose was to revisit the vestry where the Reverend and Victoria had quarreled. The church was empty at this hour, the afternoon light filtering through stained glass in bars of dimony. Shed color. The vestry was locked, but Miss Marple did not attempt to enter. Instead, she stood in the sanctuary, observing the space where Victoria had stood while singing that fractured carol. From this vantage point, one could see clearly to the rear of the church where the Ashford family had been seated. The line of sight was direct and unavoidable. If Victoria had chosen to look toward that section of the congregation, she would have had no difficulty seeing any particular face. As Miss Marple stood there, the Reverend Whitmore emerged from the side door that led to the vestry. He appeared startled to encounter her, though he recovered quickly with the practiced graciousness of his position. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find anyone here. I was just arranging the candles for the Christmas Eve service. Have you come for the same purpose?" In a manner of speaking, Miss Marple replied. "Reverend, I wonder if you would clarify something for me. When Miss Lane spoke with you yesterday, what precisely was the nature of your conversation? I ask not out of idle curiosity, but because I believe it may be relevant to understanding her disappearance." The Reverend's face tightened. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might refuse to answer, but instead he sank onto the nearest pew, looking suddenly diminished. "She asked me to confirm her version of events from 1988. She said that, if I refused, she would speak publicly about what she had witnessed. She asked me to consider the consequences for people I cared about, specifically for Christine." "And what had she witnessed?" Miss Marple asked gently, seating herself beside him. "An accident that wasn't an accident," the Reverend said quietly. "At least, not in the way it was officially reported. Victoria saw something that night during rehearsal, something she has carried for nearly 3 decades. She came back to Thorn Field with the intention of finally revealing it. She believed that silence, prolonged over so many years, had become its own form of cruelty. To whom was it cruel?" Miss Marple pressed. The Reverend looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "To Thomas Ashford himself, and to everyone who has suffered beneath the weight of that lie." Before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, they were interrupted by a constable who entered the church breathlessly. The expression on his face indicated that the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Victoria Lane, it seemed, had finally been found. Victoria Lane had been discovered in the old boathouse beside Thornfield's modest pond, the structure that had served generations of villagers as a place for quiet reflection and clandestine meetings. She was alive, though barely conscious, suffering from exposure and a head wound that suggested she had fallen or been struck with considerable force. The constable's breathless announcement sent both Miss Marple and the Reverend hurrying toward the police vehicles that were already assembling outside the church. The boathouse, when Miss Marple arrived at the scene, was cordoned with the officious yellow tape that transformed private tragedy into public spectacle. Superintendent Harris was already examining the interior, his careful attention focused on a wooden beam that had apparently descended with enough violence to render Victoria unconscious. The medical personnel were preparing her for transport to the hospital in the neighboring town, their practiced efficiency suggesting they had encountered such situations before, though Miss Marple suspected they rarely encountered them in Christmas Eve circumstances. "It appears to be an accident," Harris said, approaching Miss Marple as she stood at the boathouse entrance. "The beam was poorly secured. It's been deteriorating for you. Ours. Miss Lane must have disturbed it when she entered, and it came down upon her. She's fortunate to be alive." Miss Marple observed the beam with considerable interest, then examined the floor beneath it. The dust patterns suggested recent disturbance, yes, but they also suggested something else. "Superintendent, That beam appears to have been deliberately loosened. You can see where the supports have been deliberately pried away from their moorings. The deterioration you mentioned would not produce such neat separation." Harris's expression shifted from conclusion to consideration. He knelt to examine the supports more closely, his jaw tightening as he realized the implications. "Someone set a trap." "Someone," Miss Marple corrected gently, "created a situation that appeared accidental but was deliberately engineered. This is distinctly different from a simple trap, which implies preparation. This suggests opportunism. Someone who knew Miss Lane would come to this location and who used existing structural vulnerabilities to create the appearance of misfortune." "How could anyone know she would come here?" Harris asked. "Perhaps they didn't know precisely when, but they may have known she would come eventually," Miss Marple replied. "A person intent on revealing secrets often seeks privacy for reflection. The boathouse, being isolated and belonging to no one in particular, would be an obvious choice for someone who wished to think undisturbed." Within hours, Christine Ashford had been released from her questioning without charges, and the focus of the investigation had shifted dramatically. Victoria Lane, recovering in the hospital, was now not a missing person but an assault victim. The village, which had been preparing for Christmas celebrations, found itself instead contemplating the possibility that attempted murder had walked among them. Miss Marple returned to her cottage as evening descended, finding Mrs. Hudson still present despite the late hour, her concern for her employer's well-being having overridden her usual departure time. Together they prepared a simple supper while the radio played carols in the background, an incongruity that struck Miss Marple as peculiarly modern. Violence and Christmas songs existing simultaneously in the same domestic space. It was nearly 8 o'clock when the telephone rang. The caller was Superintendent Harris, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had encountered unexpected complexity. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know that Miss Lane has regained consciousness. She's still quite groggy from the medication, but she's been able to provide us with some information. She says she went to the boathouse deliberately, having arranged to meet someone there. She didn't see who attacked her. The blow came from behind, but she's adamant that she was lured there under false pretenses." "Did she specify who arranged this meeting?" Miss Marple asked. "She received a telephone call at approximately 2 o'clock this afternoon. A voice she didn't immediately recognize asked her to meet them at the boathouse at 4 o'clock. The caller claimed to have information about Thomas Ashford's accident and said they wished to speak with her privately before the police investigation progressed further. Miss Lane thought it was someone from the village wanting to corroborate her account." Miss Marple set down the telephone receiver after Harris concluded his call, her mind already engaged in the process of elimination. The voice had been sufficiently disguised that Victoria couldn't identify it. The message had been calculated to draw her to a specific location where an accident could be arranged. The perpetrator had possessed knowledge of the boathouse's structural vulnerabilities. She rose, and moved to a small bookshelf, retrieving a volume she had consulted years ago, the parish records from 1988. Turning to the summer entries, she found the documentation of Thomas Ashford's accident. The report was thorough but contained one curious detail that she had overlooked during her earlier recollection. The person who had discovered Thomas after his fall was not, as one might expect, a fellow cast member, but rather Margaret Ashford herself. Margaret had been present at rehearsal that evening. Though not as a member of the theatrical society, she had come to collect her brother for an appointment. Miss Marple closed the record book, her suspicions crystallizing into something approaching certainty. She had one more question that required answering, and it would require a delicate conversation with someone who had thus far remained peripheral to the investigation's focus. The question concerned not what had happened to Victoria Lane in the boathouse, but rather what had happened to Thomas Ashford in 1988, and more importantly, where Thomas Ashford was now. Christmas morning dawned grey and cold over Thornfield, a day that should have brought joy and celebration but instead carried the weight of unresolved violence. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and sat with her tea while the village remained largely asleep. She had made a decision during the night that required both courage and careful consideration of the consequences. Before the day progressed further, she needed to speak with Margaret Ashford directly. The Ashford residence was a substantial Victorian house on the village's most prestigious street, its windows dark except for a single light in what Miss Marple knew to be the morning room. She walked there deliberately, her pace measured, her appearance that of a woman making a social call rather than conducting an investigation. The early hour was admittedly unconventional, but Christmas morning provided sufficient excuse. Margaret Ashford answered the door herself, still in her dressing gown, her expression shifting from surprise to something approximating wariness when she recognized her caller. She was a woman of 62, well preserved through the careful application of discipline and expensive maintenance. But this morning, her careful facade appeared diminished by lack of sleep and evident anxiety. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected visit," Margaret said, though she stepped aside to permit entry. "Is something the matter? Have you heard news about that dreadful woman?" "I have come," Miss Marple said gently as she settled into the offered chair, "to discuss your brother, Thomas. I've been reflecting on the accident of 1988, and I find myself with several questions that I believe you are in a position to answer." Margaret's face went rigid. "That was decades ago, Miss Marple. I hardly see how it's relevant to current events." "It is relevant," Miss Marple replied with quiet certainty, "because Victoria Lane witnessed something that night that contradicted the official account. She has returned to Thornfield with the intention of revealing what she saw. Someone has attempted to silence her by arranging what was meant to appear as an accident. The pattern, I find, is remarkably similar to the circumstances surrounding your brother's injury." "You're suggesting," Margaret said slowly, "that my brother's accident was not what it appeared to be." "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple corrected. "I'm asking you to tell me what actually occurred." Victoria Lane saw something during that rehearsal, something that frightened her sufficiently that she left the village within days and remained away for a decade. Whatever she witnessed was significant enough that she came back determined to speak about it. And it is significant enough now that someone has attempted to kill her rather than allow her to testify. Margaret rose and moved to the window, her back to Miss Marple, her shoulders tense beneath the silk of her dressing gown. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas wasn't careless. He was pushed. The admission hung in the morning air between them. Miss Marple waited, understanding that sometimes silence was the most effective tool for extracting further truth. "There was a boy," Margaret continued, still facing the window. "One of the other cast members. He was infatuated with Victoria Lane, obsessively so. Thomas saw him attempting to force his attentions on her during a break in rehearsal. Thomas intervened, they argued, and the boy was humiliated in front of the other cast members. He was a volatile person, prone to rage when his ego was damaged. And Victoria witnessed this confrontation," Miss Marple said. "She witnessed him following Thomas up to the rigging shortly after. She thought they were continuing their argument, but when she heard Thomas scream, she realized something had happened. By the time she reached him, he had already fallen. The boy claimed it was an accident, said they had been examining the equipment together, and Thomas had been careless. Everyone believed him because Thomas was unconscious and couldn't contradict the account." "Where is this boy now?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret turned from the window, and Miss Marple saw that tears had traced paths down her carefully composed face. "That's the horror of it, Miss Marple. After Thomas recovered, he was never quite the same. He left Thornfield, moved to Australia, cut himself off from his family. He died 8 years ago. A suicide, though it was never officially reported as such. The family maintained he had simply had an accident while traveling, and the boy who pushed him. He left the village shortly after as well. His family moved away, and he was never questioned thoroughly because Thomas's account was so muddled from the head injury that no one was certain what had actually occurred. But I knew," Margaret said, her voice hardening. "I knew what he had done, and I have spent 30 years protecting his identity, because to reveal it would have required revealing what he had done to Thomas, and that would have meant our family's humiliation becoming public knowledge." Miss Marple's mind rearranged the pieces with this new information. And this boy, Margaret, do you happen to know where he is now?" Margaret's expression shifted to something approaching fear. "He came back to Thornfield 6 months ago. He purchased the old Pemberton cottage on the eastern edge of the village. He's been very quiet, keeping to himself, but he's here. He's been here all along while Victoria Lane was preparing to expose what he did. His name," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Robert Ashford," Margaret whispered. "My cousin. We've kept his involvement completely separate from the family, but he shares our name. When he came back, I was terrified that Victoria might recognize him, might remember what she had seen that night. The implications crystallized into terrible clarity. Thomas Ashford's cousin had returned to the village precisely when Victoria Lane had, and he had known, or learned, that she possessed dangerous knowledge of his crime. The attempted murder in the boathouse was not a new crime at all. It was the continuation of a violence that had begun 30 years earlier. Miss Marple left the Ashford residence with the weight of Margaret's confession settling heavily upon her shoulders. The village was beginning to stir as morning progressed. Families emerging for Christmas Day, children eager to open presents, the ordinary rituals of celebration proceeding with determined cheerfulness despite the shadow that had fallen over Thornfield. She walked directly to the police station, where she found Superintendent Harris reviewing overnight reports with the exhausted determination of a man who had not slept. "Superintendent," Miss Marple announced without preamble, "I believe I can tell you the identity of the person who attacked Victoria Lane. However, before I do, I must ask you to verify something for me. I need to know whether a man named Robert Ashford has taken residence in the Pemberton cottage on Eastfield Lane within the past 6 months. Harris looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from weariness to sharp attention. Within minutes, his constables had confirmed the information. Robert Ashford, 59 years old, had indeed purchased the property in June. He was a retired financial advisor who had indicated to his neighbors that he sought a quiet village life after decades in London. Beyond that, he kept largely to himself. "I need to speak with Christine Ashford," Miss Marple said, "not in an official capacity, but privately. I believe she holds knowledge that she has been afraid to share, and I think I can persuade her to speak truthfully if given the opportunity." Harris was skeptical but deferred to Miss Marple's judgment. Within an hour, Christine had been brought to the police station at Miss Marple's request, though she was not placed under arrest. She was allowed to sit in a small, comfortable room rather than an interrogation cell, and Miss Marple was permitted to speak with her alone before any official questioning commenced. Christine's face was pale, her hands trembling as she sat across from Miss Marple. The younger woman had the appearance of someone who had carried a burden far too heavy for her shoulders to bear. "I know about Robert Ashford and what he did to your Uncle Thomas," Miss Marple said without preamble. "I also know that your mother has protected him by maintaining her silence for 30 years. What I don't know is how you came to be involved, or why you reacted so strongly to Victoria Lane's presence." Christine's face crumpled, and tears began to flow freely. "He contacted me 3 months ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "He came to my flat in London and told me that Victoria was back in the village. He said she had written to him, a threatening letter demanding that he meet with her and discuss what had happened in 1988. He was terrified. He said that if Victoria spoke publicly, everything would come out and his life would be destroyed. He asked me to help him." "Help him how?" Miss Marple asked gently. "He wanted me to befriend Victoria, to learn what she intended to do, to find out if she had told anyone else about what she'd seen. He said I should try to convince her that speaking up would only hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt, people like my mother and Uncle Thomas's memory. He said that Victoria was a selfish woman who cared only about her own sense of righteousness, and that she would destroy entire families for her principles. And did you befriend her?" "I tried," Christine said miserably. "I went to the choir practice where she was singing. I made conversation with her, invited her to social gatherings. She was kind to me, actually. She treated me like a friend, and all the while I was deceiving her, gathering information for Robert. I felt absolutely sickened by my own behavior, but Robert kept pressuring me. He said Victoria had to be stopped before she could speak publicly. When did you learn of his plan to harm her? Miss Marple asked. Christine's face went white. I didn't know specifically what he intended, but yesterday morning, he telephoned me and said that everything was going to be resolved, that Victoria would have an accident, and no one would ever need to worry about her speaking publicly again. I understood what that meant, Miss Marple. I understood, and I was too frightened to tell anyone. My mother has known about this for years, about Robert's return, about his threats, and she told me that speaking up would destroy everything. So I remained silent, and then Victoria disappeared, and I realized what I had allowed to happen. Where is Robert Ashford now? Miss Marple asked. I don't know, Christine said. But he has access to the church. He's been helping with repairs as part of his quiet integration into village life. He was there when Victoria was singing. He heard her voice waver, and he knew she was preparing to speak. That's when he must have made his plan. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her mind processing the final pieces of the puzzle. What had begun as a mystery of a missing soprano had evolved into something far more complex. A crime that spanned 3 decades, connecting past violence to present danger through the fragile threads of family loyalty and bitter resentment. Thank you for your honesty, Christine, Miss Marple said quietly. I know how difficult this must have been. Now, I believe Superintendent Harris needs to speak with you officially, but I want you to know that cooperation, at this stage, will count significantly in your favor. As Christine was led away to provide her formal statement, Miss Marple considered the final piece of the puzzle. Robert Ashford had attempted murder, but he had failed. He would now be aware that his identity had been discovered and that his crime had been exposed. The question that remained was what a desperate man with nothing left to lose might do when he realized the game was finally over. By early afternoon on Christmas Day, Robert Ashford had vanished from his cottage, leaving behind a scene that suggested hasty departure rather than leisurely abandonment. The constables who conducted the search discovered evidence of preparation, suitcases removed from storage, drawers left open, personal documents scattered across the sitting room floor. What was particularly notable, however, was the absence of any suicide note or indication of self-harm. Robert Ashford was not, it seemed, a man prepared to accept defeat passively. Superintendent Harris established a perimeter around the village and initiated a broader search expanding beyond Thornfield's immediate boundaries to include the surrounding countryside. Officers were dispatched to the railway station in the neighboring town, to the bus depot, to the motorway services where a desperate man might attempt to disappear into the anonymity of transit. Yet something in Miss Marple's mind suggested that Robert Ashford would not flee far. A man who had spent 30 years brooding over a single act of violence, who had returned to the very village where he had committed his crime, was unlikely to be moved by simple logic toward self-preservation. Miss Marple sat in the police station's small office, the Christmas decorations around her seeming increasingly incongruous with the gravity of the investigation. She had requested maps of Thornfield and its environs, and she studied them with the methodical attention that had served her so well over decades of observation. Superintendent Harris watched her with the respect born of long acquaintance and repeated validation of her intuitions. "Where would he go?" Harris asked. "He has no family here, no established connections. He's a stranger in this village, really, despite the Ashford na. Is he?" Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Or is he perhaps someone who has never truly left? Consider, Superintendent. He returned to the exact village where he committed his crime. He purchased property in a location that allowed him to observe the community. He involved himself in church repairs, volunteering in ways that would bring him into contact with village affairs. This is not the behavior of a man who wished to disappear. This is the behavior of a man who wished to control the narrative of his crime, to remain present in the space where it occurred." She traced her finger along the map, pausing at various landmarks. The church, the boathouse, the old quarry, the woodland paths. The question is not where a rational man would flee, but where an irrational man would return when cornered. Where would Robert Ashford go if he wished to complete something he had begun? Harris followed her logic and began to understand. The Theatrical Society's storage facility, the old hall where they kept the sets and equipment. The old hall was located on the village's western edge, a converted barn that had served the amateur theatrical society for nearly 40 years. It contained decades of accumulated props, costumes, and set pieces from countless productions. Crucially, it also contained the original rigging equipment from the 1988 production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, equipment that had been stored rather than discarded after Thomas Ashford's accident. Miss Marple and Superintendent Harris arrived at the hall with a contingent of constables, their approach careful and deliberate. The main doors were locked, but a side entrance had been forced open. The lock splintered where someone had pried it with considerable force. Inside, the vast space was shadowed and cluttered, filled with the detritus of theatrical ambition, painted flats depicting forests and castle, racks of costumes from decades past, boxes of props carefully labeled and stacked. It was Harris who first noticed the rigging equipment suspended above the central performance space. The old pulleys and ropes that had been stored were now arranged in a configuration that appeared deliberately constructed, a recreation perhaps of the setup from 1988. And standing beneath this arrangement, a length of rope loosely coiled in his hands, was Robert Ashford. He was a tall man, now elderly, with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested years spent in contemplation of his own darkness. When he saw the police, he did not attempt to flee or resist. Instead, he turned slowly to face them, his expression curiously empty of emotion. "He pushed me," Robert said, his voice rough from disuse or emotion. "Thomas Ashford pushed me during that rehearsal. I didn't push him. I defended myself, and he fell. Everyone believed his version because he was hurt and I was frightened, and fear made me look guilty. But I didn't push him. We know what happened in 1988, Miss Marple said quietly, stepping forward while the constables remained poised. We know that Victoria witnessed Thomas being pushed from the rigging. We also know that you have spent 30 years building a narrative in which you were the victim, not the perpetrator. But the truth doesn't change, does it? No matter how many years pass or what stories you construct." "She was going to tell," Robert said, his hands tightening around the rope. "She was going to tell everyone what she saw, and they would blame me. They would say I was a murderer, that I deliberately injured someone, but it was self-defense. It was an accident. She had no right to carry that story all these years and then decide to speak about it now. So you attempted to silence her," Harris said, "just as you attempted to silence the truth for 30 years. Robert Ashford looked at the rope in his hands, then at the rigging above. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might attempt to use it, to complete some act of self-destruction that would end the cycle of violence he had initiated. But instead, he allowed the rope to fall from his fingers, and he held out his wrists toward the constables in a gesture of surrender. "I came back to prove I belonged here," he said quietly. "To prove that I was more than what that one moment made me. But I was never more than that moment. I've only ever been the man who pushed Thomas Ashford." Robert Ashford's confession was methodical and thorough, delivered in a police interview room with the flat resignation of a man finally unburdening himself of a weight carried for too long. He admitted to the assault on Victoria Lane with barely concealed relief, as though the act of speaking the truth was itself a form of absolution he did not deserve, but desperately required. The attempted murder had been premeditated. He had loosened the boathouse beam weeks earlier, waiting for an opportunity to use it. When Christine had informed him that Victoria was preparing to speak publicly, he had lured her to the location with a telephone call from a voice deliberately altered to avoid recognition. By evening, as Christmas Day drew toward its conclusion, Thornfield had transformed from a village consumed with mystery into one processing the uncomfortable reality of having harbored a violent criminal within its midst. Superintendent Harris released a statement confirming that Robert Ashford was in custody and that the assault on Victoria Lane was no longer being investigated as an accident. The attempted murder charge was serious, but there remained the question of whether additional charges might be brought regarding his actions in 1988. It was this legal ambiguity that occupied Miss Marple's mind as she sat in her cottage that evening, the fire burning low, the Christmas celebrations of the village muted by the shadow of violence. Mrs. Hudson had long since departed, having stayed longer than protocol strictly required to ensure her employer's well-being. The wireless played carols softly, and outside, Thornfield streets were quiet, the festive decorations now seeming to belong to a different time, a different reality than the one currently inhabited by the village. Miss Marple was surprised when Reverend Whitmore called upon her at 8:30. He appeared diminished by the events of the past 2 days, his clerical collar seeming somehow too large for his neck, his eyes bearing the particular exhaustion that came from confronting human evil within one's own community. She offered him tea, which he accepted with gratitude, and they sat in companionable silence for several moments before he spoke. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," the Reverend said finally. "It's a concept central to Christianity, yet I find myself profoundly uncertain how to apply it in circumstances such as these. Robert Ashford has destroyed lives. Thomas Ashford's life, Victoria Lane's peace, Christine's innocence, Margaret's conscience. How does one forgive such destruction?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently, "forgiveness is not primarily for the benefit of the one who committed the wrong, but rather for the benefit of those who suffered because of it. Victoria Lane may choose to forgive, or she may choose not to. Margaret Ashford must find peace with her decision to remain silent. Christine must reconcile her actions with her conscience. But none of those choices are Robert Ashford's to make. He has made his choices, and now he must live within their consequences." The Reverend nodded slowly. "I've been thinking as well about Thomas Ashford, about what his life might have been had Robert not pushed him. I wonder if Thomas ever knew the true nature of his injury. Did he spend his life blaming himself for an accident that was never an accident?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said, "that Thomas understood more than his family realized. People often do. We underestimate how much the human intuition grasps about truth, even when evidence is concealed or deliberately obscured. Thomas may have known, or suspected, and that knowledge may have contributed to his eventual depression and isolation." They discussed the matter further, the Reverend gradually moving toward acceptance of a truth that was uncomfortable but ultimately clarifying. When he departed, it was with a sense of purpose. He intended, he said, to visit Victoria Lane in the hospital and to have honest conversations with Margaret and Christine about the events that had shaped their family. It was after midnight when Miss Marple received a telephone call from Victoria Lane herself. The soprano's voice was still somewhat strained, but her mind was clearly sharp. She had been told by the police of the full scope of what had occurred, and she wished to speak with Miss Marple directly. "I came back to expose the truth," Victoria said, "but I didn't realize how many people that truth would hurt. Robert Ashford will face justice for what he did to me, but what about what he did to Thomas? And what about Margaret's choice to protect him? Where is justice in that?" "Justice," Miss Marple replied, "is not always as clean as we would wish it to be. Robert Ashford will face criminal charges for the attempted murder. The assault on Thomas in 1988 may be beyond the statute of limitations, or it may not. That depends on legal technicalities that are not my province. But more importantly, Miss L.A., your return to the village and your willingness to speak have accomplished something that no legal proceedings alone could accomplish. You have forced everyone involved to confront the truth rather than continue living within comfortable lies." After the call concluded, Miss Marple sat in the darkness of her sitting room, the fire now entirely extinguished. The village outside was silent, the Christmas decorations still visible through her window, their lights forming patterns that seemed almost accusatory in their cheerfulness. She thought about Robert Ashford, spending 30 years constructing a narrative in which he was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of violence. She thought about Thomas Ashford, whose death had been caused by a cascade of events initiated by a single moment of rage. She thought about the weight that silence had placed upon Margaret Ashford's shoulders. The mystery had been solved, the criminal apprehended. Yet Miss Marple understood that true resolution was more elusive, more complicated than any police report could capture. The real work of reconciliation and healing would occupy Thornfield for years to come. The Boxing Day proceedings revealed the intricate legal complexities that surrounded Robert Ashford's case. The attempted murder charge was straightforward. Victoria Lane's testimony combined with physical evidence from the boathouse left little room for doubt. However, the question of charging Ashford for Thomas Ashford's injury in 1988 proved more complicated. Superintendent Harris consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service, explaining that while Ashford admitted to pushing Thomas, the incident occurred nearly 3 decades ago, and the original investigation had concluded it was accidental. The statute of limitations for assault had long since passed, and attempting to prosecute for grievous bodily harm faced similar temporal obstacles. What emerged instead was a peculiar form of justice, partial, incomplete, yet somehow appropriate to the circumstances. Robert Ashford would face trial for the attempted murder of Victoria Lane. That crime was recent, well documented, and carried the possibility of substantial imprisonment. The events of 1988 would likely remain unprosecuted, confined to the realm of confession and personal acknowledgement rather than legal consequence. It was a resolution that satisfied no one entirely, though Miss Marple recognized it as the most that could reasonably be achieved within the constraints of law and time. She attended Victoria Lane's release from the hospital on December 27th, a Wednesday morning when winter had settled firmly over Thornfield. The soprano emerged with her arm in a sling, her head bandaged, but her spirit apparently undaunted by her ordeal. She was greeted by Superintendent Harris with official pleasantries, but it was Miss Marple to whom she turned with genuine warmth. "I wanted to thank you," Victoria said, settling into Miss Marple's car as they drove toward the village. "The police explained that you were instrumental in identifying Robert Ashford. I suspect I would have remained unconscious in that hospital bed, and the police might have concluded my injury was indeed an accident, had you not pursued the connections between the past and present." "I merely observed patterns," Miss Marple replied with characteristic modesty. "The human heart operates within fairly predictable frameworks, Miss Lane. Violence born from wounded pride tends to express itself in similar ways across decades. When I learned about Thomas Ashford's accident and the attention Victoria had begun to receive, the parallel became apparent." Victoria gazed out at the village passing by her window. "I'm not certain I wish to remain in Thornfield," she said, quietly. "My intention was to expose the truth about what happened to Thomas, to clear his name and ensure that the burden of that night didn't continue to define my life. But now I find myself wondering whether speaking that truth has truly helped anyone, or whether I've simply scattered destruction in my wake." "Have you spoken with Margaret Ashford?" Miss Marple asked. "Not yet. I've been advised by the police to maintain distance during the investigation, but I intend to before I leave. I want her to understand that I don't blame her for protecting her family. I want her to know that my actions were motivated by a need for my own conscience to be clear, not by a desire to harm anyone." When Miss Marple dropped Victoria at her cottage, she invited the younger woman to tea on the following day. Victoria accepted gratefully, and Miss Marple spent the intervening hours considering what might be accomplished through conversation that could not be accomplished through legal proceedings or public revelation. On December 28th, as Victoria sat in Miss Marple's sitting room with a cup of Darjeeling, the older woman broached a subject that had occupied her thinking since the previous evening. "You asked whether speaking the truth has helped anyone," Miss Marple began. "I think the answer depends on what occurs in the aftermath of revelation. If the village simply absorbs this event as scandal and moves on, then perhaps nothing has been truly resolved. But if people use this moment to engage honestly with one another, to acknowledge the ways that silence has harmed relationships and communities, then something meaningful may emerge." "Do you truly believe that's possible?" Victoria asked skeptically. "I've lived a very long time," Miss Marple replied, "and I've observed that human beings possess a remarkable capacity for growth when presented with undeniable truth." Margaret Ash. Ford cannot unsee what she has acknowledged about her protection of Robert. Christine cannot unknow her own complicity in his plans. The Reverend cannot return to his previous comfortable assumptions about human nature. These discomforts may, in time, lead to genuine transformation. She paused, allowing Victoria to absorb this perspective. "Your role in this village is not finished, I think, though I suspect you feel it should be. Before you depart, I would encourage you to have those conversations you mentioned, with Margaret, with Christine perhaps, even with Robert Ashford himself if circumstances permit, not for his benefit, but for your own. Completing the circle of communication is essential for genuine closure. Victoria departed late that afternoon, promising to consider Miss Marple's suggestions. Outside, the December light was fading rapidly, the winter solstice having passed days earlier, the year now turning incrementally toward spring. The Christmas decorations that had adorned Thornfield began to be removed, shop windows returning to their ordinary displays, the village resuming its customary appearance. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in the emotional landscape of the community. The comfortable assumptions about human nature, about the safety of small villages, about the efficacy of silence had all been shattered. What would grow in the spaces left by those shattered certainties remained to be seen, but Miss Marple understood that growth of some kind was inevitable. Thornfield, like all communities touched by violence and revelation, would never be quite the same. The trial of Robert Ashford commenced on January 15th, a grey Wednesday that carried with it the weight of winter and unresolved tensions. The courtroom was crowded with villagers, journalists, and the curious amalgamation of humanity that gathered whenever violence touched a small calm. Munity. Miss Marple observed from the public gallery, her knitting needles clicking softly as she formed patterns that somehow aided her concentration during proceedings that would have bored most observers to distraction. Victoria Lane testified with composure, describing her encounter at the boathouse with clinical precision. She detailed the telephone call that had lured her to the location, the moment of impact when the beam descended, the consciousness that had returned only in the hospital. Her evidence was devastating in its clarity, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. The defense counsel attempted to suggest that Ashford had been provoked, that his actions represented a moment of desperation rather than calculated malice, but the premeditation was evident in every detail of the crime's construction. Margaret Ashford attended the trial sitting in the gallery several rows behind Miss Marple. The older woman appeared diminished by the proceedings, as though public exposure of family shame had somehow reduced her physical stature. Christine sat beside her mother, their connection appearing fragile but present. Miss Marple observed their expressions carefully, noting the way Margaret's hands occasionally reached toward her daughter's arm, seeking and receiving comfort. It was during the second day of testimony that a moment occurred which transformed the trial from a simple prosecution into something more significant. Robert Ashford, choosing to testify in his own defense despite his counsel's advice, made a statement that reverberated through the courtroom with unexpected power. He did not attempt to deny the assault on Victoria. Instead, he spoke directly to the bench about the incident in 1988, offering an account that contradicted his earlier confession. "I told the police I pushed Thomas Ashford," Robert said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "But Hat wasn't entirely accurate. We struggled. He was defending Victoria Lane from my advances, and he was right to do so. During that struggle, I pushed him, yes, but I didn't intend for him to fall. I was as shocked as anyone when he went over the edge. And then, in that moment of panic, I chose to let him take responsibility for an accident that was partly my fault. I was 27 years old, angry, humiliated. I made a choice to preserve myself at his expense. The admission hung in the courtroom like a verdict rendered before the actual verdict was delivered. Margaret Ashford made a small sound, something between a gasp and a cry, and Christine's arm wrapped around her mother's shoulders in an instinctive gesture of support. "I've spent 30 years telling myself that story," Robert continued. "I've spent 30 years believing that I was the victim, that Thomas was careless, that Victoria was wrong to carry the truth. But listening to her testimony yesterday, I realized something. The truth was always the truth, regardless of what narrative I constructed around it. My attempt to silence her was not about protecting myself from false accusation. It was about forcing the world to accept the lie I had built my life upon." The judge allowed the testimony to continue, recognizing its relevance to the proceedings. Robert Ashford's confession transformed his defense from a claim of innocence into an acknowledgement of guilt, so complete that conviction became inevitable. When the jury deliberated, they required less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict on the charge of attempted murder. After the verdict was delivered, Miss Marple found herself approached by Margaret Ashford in the courthouse corridor. The older woman appeared to have aged years in the course of a single trial, her face lined with the exhaustion of confronting truths that had been deliberately company. "And sealed for 3 decades. Thank you," Margaret said simply. "I know that seems an odd thing to say to the person who exposed my family's secrets, but I mean it. I have been living a half-life for so long, Miss Marple. Protecting Robert, protecting our family's reputation, protecting everyone but myself. Hearing him speak today, hearing him finally acknowledge what actually happened, it somehow makes the burden lighter. Not light, but lighter." Miss Marple took Margaret's hand gently. "The truth, once spoken aloud, loses some of its power to harm us," she said. "We spend so much energy maintaining lies that we forget how exhausting deception truly is. Your brother Thomas died believing himself responsible for an accident that was not entirely his fault. You've lived 30 years protecting a man who did not deserve protection. Perhaps now you can all begin to heal." Christine emerged from the courtroom, and the 3 women stood together in an odd tableau: the detective, the protective sister, the reluctant accomplice, each understanding in their own way how violence and silence had woven themselves into the fabric of their lives. In the weeks that followed, Thornfield gradually returned to its customary rhythms. Robert Ashford was sentenced to 8 years' imprisonment, a term that acknowledged both the severity of his crime and the unusual circumstances of his psychological state. Victoria Lane remained in the village for 3 additional months, during which she had lengthy conversations with Margaret and Christine Ashford. These conversations did not erase the past, but they created spaces where understanding could begin to flourish. Miss Marple resumed her quiet life of observation and reflection. She sat in her garden as spring approached, watching the village renew itself with the turning of seasons. The Christmas decorations were long since removed, replaced by the ordinary furnishings of a small community proceeding with its daily existence. Yet something had fundamentally altered in Thornfield's relationship with truth. The comfortable illusions had been shattered, and what emerged in their place was a more honest, if less comfortable, acknowledgement of human complexity. On a mild April afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter from Victoria Lane, postmarked from London. The soprano wrote of her return to her career, of the ways that speaking truth had liberated her from the weight of silence. She wrote as well of her intention to return to Thornfield each summer, to maintain the connections that had been forged through trauma and revelation. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it among her treasured possessions. She had solved the mystery of who had attempted to harm Victoria Lane, but the true revelation had been something far more significant. The understanding that justice, healing, and growth emerged not from solving crimes, but from the courage required to speak truths that had been deliberately concealed. In Thornfield, as in all communities, the crime was ultimately less damaging than the silence that had preceded it.